I'm Ruby, and you won't believe the incredible turn of events in my life. One moment I was leading an ordinary teenage life, and the next, everything was flipped upside down, forcing me to confront something so mortifying that even discussing it now sends shivers down my spine. Sometimes people turn out to be quite different from what we originally thought. I had my world rocked when I uncovered the truth about a newfound friend of mine. It all commenced last summer when my friends were busy with their summer jobs, leaving me with a strong desire to do something rather than idling away at home. It wasn't like I needed the money, given that my family was fairly well off, but I was yearning for excitement. That's when I applied for a position at a charming little cafe in town, known as the go-to spot for all the trend-setting folks. It exuded a student-friendly ambience. When I received the news that I got the job, I was over the moon with excitement. The young woman who conducted my interview was slightly older than me, unmistakably a student herself. She complimented my unique last name, and I was charmed by her warm demeanor. She sported the most stunning, long black hair and adorned herself with a plethora of chick piercings, not to mention a captivating tattoo. She appeared as though she belonged on the cover of an edgy rock and roll magazine. I remember thinking, when I grow up, I want to be just like her. Her name was Nora, and somehow we always ended up working the same shifts. The more I got to know her, the clearer it became how much we had in common. Nora shared my love for the same bands, and she even played the guitar. She was pursuing a degree in English literature at one of the local colleges, and I shared my aspiration to study the same subject. I mentioned that my dad was a professor of English literature, and I wondered if she might know him. However, she claimed not to be familiar with him, and swiftly changed the topic. During our shifts at work, we consistently had lunch together, and I would bring along cookies and other treats to share. Occasionally, we'd escape to the park and simply lie back, soaking in the relaxing atmosphere. It was such a wonderful time, and I found myself growing increasingly excited about going to work, realizing just how much I admired this girl. Nora embodied everything I aspired to be, and yet, there was something more. At 15 years old, I couldn't quite comprehend what I was experiencing, but I began to develop feelings for her. I had never considered the possibility of being attracted to a girl before, but there was an undeniable magnetic quality about her that stirred up a sense of excitement within me. It felt like a flurry of butterflies in my stomach. I soon recognized that she was the first girl I had ever developed a crush on, and it was an entirely new sensation for me. One day, as we lay in the park, she rolled over towards me and propped herself up on her elbow. With a heart pounding so loudly I feared she might hear it, I realized just how deeply I cared for her. In my shyness, I didn't respond verbally, but I chuckled nervously and suggested we return to work. Throughout the remainder of our shift, I couldn't take my eyes off her, and eventually, I summoned the courage to invite her to hang out after work. I mentioned that my parents were out and suggested she bring her guitar so we could jam together. Nora was thrilled and agreed to come over later that night. As I pedaled my way home, I made up my mind that tonight was the night I'd express my feelings for her. Was it a date? Was she coming as a friend, or because she had romantic inclinations toward me as well? I contemplated these questions as I rode home, resolving that whatever the nature of our meeting, we would have a pleasant evening. Nora arrived shortly after I got home, and I decided to give her a tour of our house. Her eyes widened in amazement as she took in the spaciousness of our place. When I showed her our movie room, her jaw literally dropped. It was strange because she seemed to know her way around without my guidance. I didn't even need to show her where the bathroom was. She suggested that we watch a movie instead of playing guitar, and I readily agreed. I encouraged her to make herself at home while I went to prepare some popcorn. While waiting for the popcorn to be ready, I noticed Nora standing in the hall, gazing at our family photos. She reached out to touch one of them, and a smile graced her lips. My heart raced, and it became evident that she held a genuine interest in me. Perhaps we might share a kiss in the theater. The thought made me nervous, and I hoped I wasn't perspiring, as I tended to do when anxious. Nora eventually joined me in the kitchen and remarked, "No wonder you're so pretty, Ruby. Your parents are really attractive." I chuckled in response but felt a warm blush rise to my cheeks. We returned to the movie room, but halfway through the film, I heard my parents arriving home. I felt somewhat disheartened because Nora hadn't made any moves, not even holding my hand. I attempted the subtle yawn and stretch maneuver to initiate contact, but she didn't seem to notice. At that point, I thought it might be a good idea to pause the movie and introduce her to my parents. I mentioned this to her, and she froze, her reaction leaving me bewildered. Suddenly, Nora concocted a hasty excuse about needing to rush home and inquired if there was a discreet way for her to exit. She expressed discomfort around her parents due to their critical stance on her piercings, fearing they might view her as a negative influence on me. Her sudden departure left me somewhat bewildered, but I assured her she could slip out through the back door without drawing attention. Following her abrupt exit, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Perhaps she didn't share my feelings, or maybe she was trying to shield me in case my parents disapproved of my affection for girls. In her haste, she had left her guitar behind, so I brought it into the kitchen and placed it on one of the chairs before bidding my parents goodnight. The next morning, as I descended the stairs, I encountered my dad holding Nora's guitar, his expression taking on an unusual intensity. When he noticed me, he hastily set it down and, in an agitated tone, demanded to know whose guitar it was and why it was in our house. I couldn't fathom why he was so furious. I explained that it belonged to a friend from work who had inadvertently left it behind. His anger escalated as he questioned why I thought it was permissible to invite a work friend over without seeking his approval. He then insisted on knowing the identity of this friend. Attempting to defuse the situation, I implored him to calm down. However, exasperated, I grabbed the guitar and headed for the door, baffled by his unwarranted anger. Who did he think he was, berating me for having a boyfriend? I was fraught with fear during the journey to work, grappling with the possibility that my dad had somehow intuited my romantic feelings for this girl. At work, Nora resumed her usual cheerful demeanor and extended an apology for her abrupt exit the previous night. I mustered the courage to ask her if she'd like to spend time together again, perhaps genuinely playing our guitars this time. She responded positively, agreeing that she was available that afternoon. I knew my dad would be at work, so I invited Nora to come over. The shift at work seemed to drag on endlessly, making the wait even more excruciating. At noon, Nora stepped out to meet a friend, leaving me to have lunch by myself. We rode our bikes back to my house together, and I noticed that my mom was home. I asked Nora if it was all right with her, and though she appeared somewhat uneasy, she agreed. My mom was the kindest person, so Nora had nothing to worry about. When my mom met Nora, she greeted her warmly, saying, "Oh, it's lovely to meet you, Nora. You must be the new friend Ruby has been talking about so much. It's a pleasure to have you here." What transpired next caught me entirely off guard. Nora's countenance transformed into an unusual, chilly expression. It was the first time I had ever seen her appear so distant. She gazed at my mom and commented, "Oh, you look quite different in person. Those pictures of you in the hallway must be quite old, I assume." With that, she simply walked away and entered my room. I was utterly mortified. My mom tried to brush it off and maintained a forced smile, but I knew I was in for a substantial scolding later on. Both my mom and dad would undoubtedly disapprove of me associating with someone like Nora. When I entered my room, I kept silent, anticipating at least an apology from her, but she seemed uninterested, fixating her gaze on my bookshelves. I endeavored not to let it trouble me too much, as she had previously mentioned feeling uncomfortable around parents. I decided to play some music and reclined on my bed. "Where's your guitar, Nora?" I suddenly inquired. I noticed that she hadn't brought it along. Her eyes widened slightly, and then she stammered, I actually left it at my boyfriend's place during lunch." "I'm sorry, Ruby." I attempted not to let jealousy creep in, but I couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy that she had another boyfriend. "Why don't you give your friend a call and see if we can swing by to pick up your guitar?" I suggested. Nora's response hit me like a ton of bricks. She mentioned that her boyfriend was working and wouldn't be checking his messages while on the job. My heart plummeted. It confirmed my worst fears. This friend was likely her boyfriend all along. What had I been thinking? She clearly wasn't interested in me at all. A sudden wave of nausea washed over me, and the idea of her being in my room now made me uncomfortable. "Nora, I'm sorry, but I'm not feeling very well. Can we reschedule and hang out tomorrow instead?" I mustered the words, and though she appeared somewhat surprised, she agreed. She even offered to cover for me at work if I still felt unwell the next day. After she left, I shed a few tears, then then scolded myself for crying and decided to take a nap instead. Upon waking, hunger drove me downstairs to prepare a snack. My dad had just returned home and was unloading groceries from the car. I offered to help, but he assured me he could handle it. However, as I reached for the last bag of groceries, I froze in my tracks. You won't believe what I found in the back of my dad's trunk. It was unmistakable from the moment I laid eyes on it. Adorned with those cherry stickers, it couldn't belong to anyone else but Nora. Why on earth would my dad have Nora's guitar in his car? It defied all logic. I had returned it to her earlier that day, and she had left it at her friend's house. Then, the realization struck me like a bolt of lightning, and I felt as though I might be sick. Recollections flooded my mind, the way she had scrutinized my family photos, the derogatory comment about my mother, the recognition in her eyes when she saw my last name during the job interview, her study of English literature. It all fell into place. Nora was engaged in some sort of affair with my dad. Overwhelmed by the revelation, I couldn't bring myself to confront my dad at that moment, and I didn't want to cause my mom any pain, but I knew I had to do something about it. Fueled by a surge of emotions, I hastily hopped on my bike and pedaled to Nora's apartment. Despite never having been there before, I didn't bother knocking. I simply barged in, and the moment she laid eyes on me, her expression turned to one of shock. My anger surged, and I began to shout at her, demanding answers. How could you do this? I saw your guitar in my dad's car, and you pretended to be my friend just to get close to him. What kind of twisted person are you? He's a married man. Nora didn't attempt to deny it or shed any tears. She didn't even make an effort to seek forgiveness. Instead, she locked eyes with me and callously remarked, "It's not my fault your dad likes me. Friends in the family, right? You had feelings for me too, didn't you?" I was left utterly dumbfounded, unsure of how to proceed. Despite the impending devastation it would bring to my mom, I knew I had to tell her the truth, and I had to confront my dad. I informed Nora that I never wanted to see her again, and in a fit of anger, I flung her guitar to the floor, taking a secret sense of satisfaction as it broke into 2 pieces. When I returned home, I found my dad sitting with his head in his hands. He must have known that I had discovered the affair and had shared my discovery with my mom, who was crying inside the house. The entire situation felt surreal. Just a few hours earlier, I had brought the girl I had a crush on into my home, completely unaware that she had been secretly engaging in an affair with my dad all along. My dad's job was now at risk, and part of me even hoped that he would lose it as a consequence of his actions. My dad deserved consequences for his actions as well. I sat with my mom, comforting her as she wept and repeatedly apologized for inadvertently welcoming that monster into our home. My dad packed a bag and moved in with his brother, leaving my mom and me to figure out our next steps. Naturally, I resigned from my job at the cafe. I couldn't bear the thought of being around Nora any longer. I felt utterly defeated. I had lost the girl I had feelings for, and now I had lost my dad as well. The embarrassment was overwhelming. If that weren't enough, another blow struck our family soon after. It became evident that Nora was grappling with mental illness. A week later, the newspapers were filled with her story, as she had sold it to the reporters. This meant my father would never be able to work as a professor again. I thought it couldn't possibly get any worse, but for my family, it did. My dad lost his job, and he also lost us. My mom initiated divorce proceedings, and it has been almost a year since the ordeal unfolded. We are only just beginning to recover. This past year has undoubtedly been the most challenging, with newspapers publishing all the sordid details of Nora's affair, which had been ongoing for over a year. It was even revealed that she had been to our house before, with a photograph of them together in our pool, explaining her familiarity with our home. The entire situation continues to haunt me, but I am grateful that it is now in the past. I have made a firm decision that I want nothing to do with becoming anything like Nora as I grow older. As for my mom and me, we believe we are better off without my dad. Perhaps one day we will find it in our hearts to forgive him, but for now, the wounds are still too fresh. Nevertheless, we are moving forward, one step at a time.